Matthew 22:7. But when the king heard it. This punishment is mentioned by Matthew alone, for Luke makes no mention of any outrage committed on the servants. Both concur in stating that those who did not come at the appointed time were shut out, and deprived of the honor of being present at the banquet. But this doctrine applies equally to us, for the same destruction which Christ denounces against the Jews awaits all the ungodly, who violently oppose the ministers of the gospel. Those who are so entirely occupied with earthly cares, as to set no value on the divine invitation, will at length perish miserably in famine and want, and therefore, whenever God calls us, let us be prepared and ready to follow. 9. Go therefore to the highways. Having shown that they are unworthy of the grace of God who disdainfully reject it when offered to them, he now says that their place is supplied by others, by the mean and despised common people. And here is described the calling of the Gentiles, which is to excite the Jews to jealousy, as we have it in the Song of Moses. They have provoked me by those who are not gods, and I will provoke them by that which is not a people, and by a foolish nation will I enrage them. Deuteronomy 32:21. Having been first elected, they imagined that the grace of God was bound to them, as if God could not want them, and how haughtily they despised all others is well known. Thus by way of admission, he compares the Gentiles to the poor, the blind, and the lame. He says that they are called from the crossroads, and from the streets, as strangers and unknown persons, but yet declares that they will occupy that place which friends and domestics had treated with indifference. What the prophets had obscurely foretold about creating a new church is now plainly expressed. This dishonor was the completion of the divine vengeance on the Jews, when God cut them off, and engrafted wild branches into the stock of the olive tree, Romans 11:17. When he threw them off, and received the polluted and filthy Gentiles into his house. But if at that time he spared not the natural branches, Romans 11:21, the same punishment will this day be inflicted on us, if we do not answer to his call. The supper which had been prepared for us will not be lost, but God will invite other guests. Luke 14:23. Compel them to come in. This expression means that the master of the house would give orders to make use, as it were, of violence for compelling the attendance of the poor, and to leave out none of the lowest dregs of the people. By these words Christ declares that he would rake together all the offscourings of the world, rather than he would ever admit such ungrateful persons to his table. The allusion appears to be to the manner in which the gospel invites us, for the grace of God is not merely offered to us, but doctrine is accompanied by exhortations fitted to arouse our minds. This is a display of the astonishing goodness of God, who, after freely inviting us, and perceiving that we give ourselves up to sleep, addresses our slothfulness by earnest entreaties, and not only arouses us by exhortations, but even compels us by threatenings to draw near to him. At the same time, I do not disapprove of the use which Augustine frequently made of this passage against the Donatists, to prove that godly princes may lawfully issue edicts, for compelling obstinate and rebellious persons to worship the true God, and to maintain the unity of the faith, for, though faith is voluntary, yet we see that such methods are useful for subduing the obstinacy of those who will not yield until they are compelled. Matthew 22:11. And the king, having come in to see the guests. Here Christ does not reproach the Jews with having wickedly despised the grace and calling of God, but gives early warning to those who would be placed in their room, not to pollute with their filth the holy marriage, when God shall bestow upon them admission to his table. Hitherto he has taught that the Jews, on account of their ungodly and disdainful conduct, would be deprived of the peculiar honor and privilege which they had enjoyed, and that from among the irreligious and abhorred Gentiles would men be called to occupy their place. But now he threatens that, out of this very number, those who bring reproach upon the church will be expelled, for God invites all indiscriminately by the gospel, and thus many unholy and abominable persons creep in, too, though for a time they are admitted along with others, yet, when God reviews the guests, will be thrown out and dragged to punishment. The general truth conveyed is, that not all who have once entered the church will become partakers of everlasting life, but only those who are found to wear the dress which befits the heavenly palace. As to the wedding garment, is it faith, or is it a holy life? This is a useless controversy, for faith cannot be separated from good works, nor do good works proceed from any other source than from faith. But Christ intended only to state, that the Lord calls us on the express condition of our being renewed by the Spirit after His image, and that, in order to our remaining permanently in His house, we must put off the old man with his pollutions, Colossians 3-9, Ephesians 4:22, and lead a new life, that the garment may correspond to so honorable a calling. But a question arises, how comes it that a beggar is punished so severely for not bringing a wedding garment, as if it were unusual to see the wretched people, who beg their bread on the public roads, wearing tattered and ugly clothes? I reply, the question is not as to the manner in which the garment is to be procured, for whomsoever the Lord invites He at the same time supplies with clothing, and in all of us is fulfilled what Ezekiel says, 16:6-14, that God finds nothing in us but wretchedness, and nakedness, and abominable filth, but adorns us with magnificent attire. We know also, that there is no other way in which we are formed anew after the image of God, but by putting on Christ, Romans 13:14, Galatians 3:27, it is not, therefore, the declaration of Christ, that the sentence of casting them into outer darkness will be executed on wretched men who did not bring a costly garment taken from their own wardrobe, but on those who shall be found in their pollution, when God shall come to make a scrutiny of His guests. Matthew 22:14. For many are called, but few are chosen. The object of the parable is pointed out by the conclusion, that few are chosen, though many are called, from which we infer, that we ought not to attempt an ingenious explanation of every minute clause. But lately, Christ did not threaten that the greater part would be thrown out, but mentioned one man only, and now we learn from him, that out of a large number few will be retained. And certainly, though in the present day a more numerous body of men is collected into the church by the gospel than was formerly collected by the law, it is but a small portion of them whose faith is evinced by newness of life. Let us not flatter ourselves with the empty title of faith, but let every man seriously examine himself, that at the final review he may be pronounced to be one of the lawful guests. For, as Paul reminds us, that the vessels in the Lord's house are not all of the same kind, so let every one that calleth on the name of the Lord depart from iniquity. 2 Timothy 2:19-20. I enter no farther, at present, into the question about the eternal election of God, for the words of Christ mean nothing more than this, that the external profession of faith is not a sufficient proof that God will acknowledge as His people all who appear to have accepted of His invitation,